One of the techniques that you tend to make use of in the Windows Presentation Foundation is transparency. There are multiple different ways to make something transparent, so let's take a look at the different ways you can use transparency and what the limitations and abilities of each are. I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to name this Transparencies. I'm going to press F6 to move back to the design workspace. I probably should have done that at the end of the previous unit, but I think we can survive. And double-click the Pan tool to recenter my artboard. Now I'm going to create a rectangle, and let's look at the different ways we can make these transparent. Now to make the transparency a little easier to see, I'm going to select my window and give it a background. Just something a bit blatant here so the transparency is a little bit easier to see. Now I'm going to go ahead and select my rectangle, and let's work with it. I'm going to increase the stroke thickness so you can see some of the differences of what happens with the fill versus the stroke. Now first off, when you have a solid color brush, you can always adjust the alpha channel of the brush and it will modify the transparency of that portion of the rectangle. You can see here that the rectangle itself is partially transparent now, but the stroke itself remains black. With the alpha channel set to any value other than 0, the color of the solid color brush will also tint the transparency. So here I've given everything underneath somewhat of a green tint. But again, since I'm only working with the fill, it is transparent where the stroke is not. I'm going to set the alpha channel back to 100%, so I become completely opaque, and I'm going to modify the opacity of the entire control. This opacity value is applied to all of the components of the control, including the stroke. So now everything is equally transparent by 40%. If I combine the opacity here with another opacity, say the alpha channel of my solid color brush, the opacity combines, so 40% and then 50%, this will end up with an opacity of 20%. The two values are multiplied together. Now for a solid color brush, the alpha channel is applied to the entire brush. Let me set the opacity back to 100% and go to a linear gradient brush this time. The linear gradient brush, as well as the radial gradient brush, allows you to modify the alpha channel of each individual stop. So I'm going to change this gradient to go from red to black, add an extra gradient stop in the middle, and set the alpha channel of it down to 40%. Now, the gradient goes from fully opaque on both ends to 40% transparent in the middle. I can add additional gradient stops and set the alpha value of each gradient stop to any value that I want. The technique I've used here has created two wide bands at 100% completely opaque and then a somewhat transparent bar in the middle. Because of where that happened to fall, it may not be obvious, but let me move my rectangle and you'll see that that portion is in fact partially transparent. Remember though that as I'm working with my linear gradient brush, I'm working with one brush of the overall shape. So I'm working with the fill, the stroke remains completely opaque. Now I can flip that around, select the stroke, and modify its opacity by modifying the alpha channel on its brush, and the effect is applied only to the stroke, not to the fill. The opacity mask is the last type of opacity, and it's its own type of brush. Now the opacity mask works like any other brush, however the only portion of it that's interesting is the alpha channel. The opacity mask is applied to the entire object, so it will fill both the stroke and the fill, and it will apply itself over the entire region. Let me reset the stroke to a solid black, and reset the fill to a solid red. Now when I go to the opacity mask, I'm going to change this to a radial gradient, and set the inner gradient stop to completely transparent. Now the mask is applied on top of everything else, and it goes from completely transparent in the center to completely opaque on the edges. The opacity mask can be transformed with the brush transform tool the same way that any of the other brushes can. So as I take this and stretch it out to the edge, I can apply a repeat behavior, and I get concentric rings where each ring starts at completely transparent and moves to completely opaque at the outside edge. By combining all of these different techniques, not only can you get partially transparent objects and some interesting displays, but you can control how the elements display what's behind them and how they block it. I'm just going to close that project so we can carry on.